January 26th is supposed to unite Australia in theory, but is a day that divides Australia. Australia has a very whitewashed history, and you may be unaware the extent of the mistreatment of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia's history. January 26th currently marks Australia Day, which is also called Survival Day, National Day of Mourning, or Invasion Day. Hi, I'm August. I go by they, he pronouns. My mob is the Nuwagi mob in northern Queensland, but I currently live on Kaurna land in South Australia and work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in the community for my job. The point of this video is to present all perspectives on the debate and the facts, and for you to make the decision for yourself, but I'll also be providing my own perspective on changing the date later in the video. The point of the video is to educate you, the audience, on these views and facts, so you can make an educated decision on where you stand. I'm welcoming an open discussion in the comments, but please keep it civil, although knowing that this is a very heated debate, especially in Australia's current political climate, I know it's likely not going to be civil and will also probably be devoid of empathy. I want to give a massive trigger warning for racism, as it is a hard topic to avoid when discussing January 26th. I would like to advise for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers who may be watching, there are mentions of sensitive and difficult topics. I would also like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging. We would not be where we are today without them. January 26th, a brief history. January 26, 1788, marks the date of the first fleet arriving in Australia from Britain. Yet, it also marks the beginning of a genocide of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the fight for land began. Just a quick little editor's note. A couple of sources say that the first fleet didn't arrive on Australian shores January 26th, and that they arrived in Botany Bay earlier, but relocated. January 26th marks the day they planted the Union Jack flag on Australian soil, but this doesn't make the claim of it being the beginning of a genocide any less valid. When Captain Cook first landed on the shores of Australia in 1770, he went back to Britain and claimed the land terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one. Yet, there were First Nations Australians already living here. In 1935, all states and territories recognised Australia Day as a public holiday on the Monday closest to January 26th. In 1994, Australia Day, being on January 26th, became the national public holiday. In 1938, William Cooper and other Aboriginal leaders declared January 26th as a day of mourning. This is interesting, as it is more recent in history that January 26th is a public holiday and the nationally recognised Australia Day, and is more recent than when it was declared a day of mourning by Aboriginal leaders. Statistics. We have statistics and data in terms of the views on Australia Day. The following statistics are gathered from a poll commissioned by the Institute of Public Affairs, including 1,011 Australian respondents, and conducted in December of 2025. Data was collected by Dynata and is a nationally representative sample of Australians. According to the site, the margin of error is roughly 3.1%. As we can see from the results, the total agree that Australia Day should be celebrated on January 26 is 76%, while the total disagree is 10%, and 14% hold a neutral stance. What is also important to note here, though, is that this is only a sample of Australians in comparison to the millions we have on this country, so I dug around for more polls to see if the claim holds. According to Roy Morgan's 2026 SMS poll about January 26, 60.5% of Australians that filled out this poll say the date should stay as Australia Day, and is up 2% from 2024. The ages did not make a difference, as across all age brackets the majority is in support of Australia Day being on January 26th. Nobody surprised, a majority of these are One Nation supporters. Queensland led with the highest percentage of people wanting Australia Day to stay on January 26th, with 78.5%, and people in capital cities are more evenly split. 55.5% don't want the date moved, in comparison to those in rural country areas, 70%. The sample size of this was 1,311 Australians, and has a roughly 3% margin of error according to the site. Continuing this search, I came across one very recent poll covered by various news sites that state otherwise. A poll that surveyed 1,508 Australians, commissioned by Future Super on behalf of Closing the Gaps want an Australian long weekend on the second to last Monday of January, ranging anywhere between the 18th to 24th, guaranteeing them a long weekend. 54% of Australians surveyed prefer this over the 26th of January public holiday. 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted in favour of changing the date, while 63% of those aged 65 and over were opposed to the change. Across each age bracket, a majority voted in favour of changing the date, according to the survey. Across these polls, it seems like an almost even split. The first survey may have had an overwhelming majority, but in comparison to these other two surveys listed, it shows almost half of Australia is ready for a change. I will also be providing information and data collected by myself in a survey I shared, but I don't have all the data right now, so me from the future will talk about it. Take it away, future August. Thank you, past August. Let's take a look at the data. First of all, I want to say a massive thank you to all the participants of the survey. You all provided valuable information. The survey has 38 respondents, but I also recognize that this could be skewed based on the people who typically watch or find my content. And again, this is only representative of a small portion of Australians when comparing this to the other surveys. I tried to share it as far as I could online, but obviously I'm still limited. I will be referencing this survey throughout the video as it does still provide valuable information on these views. The age bracket did not seem to influence the views of wanting to change the date from my observations, and we had most people participating come from the 25 to 34 age group with 47.4%, followed by 18 to 24-year-olds and 35 to 44-year-olds. 3 out of the 38 respondents were Aboriginal. 87% do not celebrate Australia Day on January 26, and 13% do. An overwhelming majority are in support of changing the date, and 10% of participants are neutral. One question I thought interesting to ask was if participants agreed with celebrating Australia Day at all, even if on a different date, considering Australia's controversial history. 42% said maybe. I asked the participants with a linear scale on how much they knew about January 26 and the history of treatment of Indigenous Australians. More felt comfortable to label themselves as more knowledgeable about the history of treatment than about January 26. Those who were less knowledgeable were more likely to have a neutral stance. Back to you, past August. We will now get into the perspectives and why people think the way they do. Against changing the date. Those who are against changing the date seem to be very patriotic towards Australia. Kurt Mahlburg's commentary written on the Christian news site The Daily Declaration argues against changing the date with the following reasons. Majority of Australians are in support of January 26, and to change it is undemocratic. Supposedly changing the date means we can move on from the Australians living on stolen land issue. Why Australians are being cast as avatars of their ancestors. To quote what the author is saying, it's dividing Australians and assigning perpetual victimhood to Indigenous Australians and perpetual guilt to non-Indigenous. In Kurt Mahlburg's views, there's already enough dates set aside through the year to mourn the injustices of Aboriginals. The debate causes a more divided nation. Changing a date will cause more division in Mahlburg's eyes. I recognize that those reasons are very conservative, extremist views, and not everyone who is against changing the date or celebrates Australia Day holds all those same views. I want to provide a personal anecdote here quickly that makes so much sense to me. I was in a team meeting recently, and we spent a portion of that meeting talking about reconciliation, the topic being specifically about January 26th. My auntie stated how she would like things to change, but sometimes being Aboriginal and speaking up can be hard because people will just see it as us folks having a whinge again. You can see in Mahlburg's views that there is evidence to support my auntie's claim. Mahlburg believes there's enough of a focus on Aboriginal injustices and there's enough dates for focus on those things. I myself have heard this rhetoric in media too. There are some Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders who are against changing the date and have more focus on other issues that affect our communities, as they don't see this as that big of a deal. We'll return to this notion more in the next section on the video, covering the perspectives of those who want to change the date. Not many people who completed my survey were against changing a date, but this one really stood out to me. This is from one respondent who disagreed with changing a date. I don't celebrate as there is too many people. I also married into an Aboriginal family. They believe that all sides should be acknowledged. We need to acknowledge the horrible past, but also acknowledge the start of what we have today, because both are part of our history and you can't have the good without the bad. Again, not all Aboriginals agree on changing the date. This one also really stood out to me. Just enjoy the holiday. No one really gives a in the greater picture. A new date isn't going to change anything, as the day will still represent the same thing. If anything, just make a second Australia Day or some. Just celebrate it whenever. We all live here now together with Asians and insert slur here, Indians, the unclean carriers. Basically every slur for them because they made our cities much more worse to live in because of their lack of respect and common courtesy to respect the land and its people anyway. What's done is done. Kick your legs up, shrimp onto Barbie, beer in hand, and enjoy the 26th with fam. Apparently, this participant labeled themselves as very knowledgeable on the history of January 26th and the treatment of Indigenous Australians. Another recurring theme with those who are against changing the date are that many are anti-immigration too, which is another subject I'm quite passionate about, but I would go into a very off-topic tangent if I got started on it. Anyway, moving on. Or changing the date. As mentioned in the brief history of January 26th, the date was declared a day of mourning in 1938, as it marks the start of a genocide, which is why some choose not to celebrate, as it seems wrong to celebrate on the anniversary of such a tragedy. People who are for changing the date view this as an opportunity for all Australians to come together without causing pain or offence to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. A variety of alternative dates have been proposed for the date change, including January 1st, the anniversary of the Federation of Australia in 1901, celebrating the birth of the nation, and May 26th, National Sorry Day, which acknowledges the historical mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, promoting reconciliation. Other dates suggested are the 13th of February, when the government apologized to the stolen generation in 2008. Again, there is that theme of reconciliation. 20th of March, when Canberra was selected as our capital in 1913. 11th of April, when the White Australia policy was abolished in 1973 with the Migration Act. And May 27th, the day Indigenous people were allowed constitutional rights in 1967. There is also Mahlburg Day on the 3rd of June, the day the High Court of Australia overturned the legal stance of terra nullius, ruling in favour of Eddie Mahlburg's case, which is personally one of my favourite moments to look back on in history. Some people who are for changing a date celebrate Australia Day on January 26th due to familial pressures, which is something that can be seen in my survey put out. I celebrate on the 26th due to familial pressures for the most part, although I do not believe the day should be the day that the inhuman actions against the traditional people of Australia and its surrounding islands began. I want to celebrate being Australian, and I have pride in my home and the people I live alongside, and see a massive opportunity to build community as we celebrate together. The date has changed in the past, and there is no good reason to hold the date on this particular date. And because you like the date is not a good enough reason to tie a celebration of community and what Australians want to stand for to the generations of harm that were caused starting on the 26th of January, 1788. To quote another respondent, people shouldn't celebrate a day about colonization. It should be treated as a day to mourn tragedies against Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. That's more respectful and appropriate on all parties. I, however, don't get much of a choice on celebrating the holiday due to familial pressure as much as I disdain colonization. I found a Reddit thread discussing January 26th, and I found some valuable perspectives I thought we should include. I wasn't too sure where I was going to include this, but I figured it would be best suited here. I am Indigenous, and in my opinion, this issue is almost entirely fabricated and pushed by white people. Indigenous people in Australia face significant issues, and changing a date will do nothing to solve them. Changing a date will let white activists pat themselves on the back, but does nothing for the daily lives of Indigenous folks. We make up around 3% of the population, but 30% of prison inmates. Rape, murder, domestic violence, assault, and drug use are rampant in Indigenous communities at rates 10 to 100 times greater than the general population. Australia has pumped tens of billions every year into Indigenous issues and nothing has changed. The media won't even touch the real issues for fear of sounding racist, as there is not a convenient explanation that can be blamed on white people. My community has serious issues that need to be acknowledged. Whining about a date is comical compared to what's going on in the real world for Indigenous individuals. It is true that not every Indigenous individual agrees with changing a date, or are at least not focused on it, because there are bigger problems that our community faces. I see and hear about those problems in my work a lot, working with other Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander families. Although this reply to the comment I think is important to note. That's it right there. But this doesn't happen so long as there are policymakers and leaders that don't recognize that. In my experience, a white Australian who works with a lot of other white Australians and only a few Aboriginal Australians are the same people who don't want to shift the status quo for the date. Also, don't want to shift the status quo when it comes to Indigenous issues. Changing a date won't fix those issues you mentioned overnight, but the recognition of the need for change will hopefully result in a national paradigm shift in relation to Indigenous issues and highlight a national desire for improvement. At least that's why I support a change of date. Whether that is overly optimistic, I am not sure, but I am hopeful. It's about the recognition of a need for change. Right now, Australia has a long way to go when it comes to reconciliation, but this would be one step towards it. That's what it is about. This comment in the thread also stood out to me as it supports the previous claim about the symbolism of changing a date. I'm not very patriotic in the first place, so all the flag waving Straya carry on never really appealed. I used to enjoy the hottest 100 and a barbecue though. Now my opinion has definitely shifted. It's become another artifact of the forever culture war, which means I feel like I end up side-eyeing anybody celebrating. Chances are they're just enjoying the day off and what's good about this country. But it feels like there's plenty of others almost despite celebrating. I think advocates for changing the date have a strong argument. This country's got a dark history and we get nowhere by glossing over it and ignoring it. Changing a date won't solve much of anything in a material way, but it is something, and symbolism is better than nothing. Still won't be waving a plastic flag about though. I want to take this chance to discuss a song by Aboriginal and Dan Sultan, January 26, released in 2016. A banger. It also delves not only into the concept of Australia Day being on January 26th, but the flag being racist too. Often I have seen neo-Nazis waving the Australian flag proudly, not to mention the racist history of the flag concerning the British Union Jack still plastered on the flag, a representation of colonization. Colonization led to the death of many Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. The song's lyrics criticize the fact that some Australians do not wish to educate themselves, but will spend plenty of time watching TV shows. White Australians, not all, but indeed some, want to ignore the history, thinking that it doesn't affect us, ignoring all the intergenerational trauma. This part of the song again dives into the fact that many Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders died, and it all started with the day, January 26th. This song also discusses that the conversation actively gets ignored, and Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders must start the conversation constantly. White Australia has a black history that people want to ignore. Let's look at the responses to my survey. It was heartwarming to see that many people have empathy and want to support and respect Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. That's why they want to see the date change. Let's bring up that final part of the survey again. Please explain to me why you do or do not celebrate Australia Day on January 26th and why you think the date should not be changed. Out of respect of my Indigenous friends, I haven't celebrated Australia Day in years. Change the date so we can all enjoy our beautiful country without this being a topic every January. People are also tired of having the conversation every January. It becomes a hot topic in the news and mainstream Australian media, yet there's such a huge focus on the division rather than the history and facts of it. Ethnic cleansing and genocide shouldn't be celebrated. Australia Day marks the beginning of colonisation of Australia, and the massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is nothing that deserves celebrating. Many people do not want to celebrate on the day that is the start of a genocide and colonisation. Associating our country's pride with genocide is disgusting, and spending a day of historical violence barbecuing and celebrating and getting drunk is both disrespectful and sickening. Typically don't celebrate, but think the date should change as it's an offensive day, and Australia Day should celebrate what we have become, not the atrocities associated with Invasion Day. The date itself is arbitrary, and we've only celebrated it since the 90s. I don't celebrate it because it's not a thing to celebrate. The near genocide of First Nations people and the forceful theft of their land. This person in the 35 to 44 age bracket makes a point that the celebration on January 26th only started in the 90s. The following respondent makes a similar point. 26th of January is a day of mourning, not a celebratory victory day. Growing up in the 80s, Australia Day wasn't in January, it was in July, depending on your state. Back in 1994, the entire nation started making it a celebration on the 26th of Jan, which is disgraceful, not to mention the disrespect to our First Nations community. Even as a kid, it felt all kinds of wrong. No, people are happy on such a tragic day. My kids feel deeply disturbed that the entire nation is happy getting drunk while our First Nations communities can't afford food, electricity, fuel, doctors, healthcare, etc., especially further out bush. I'll never hide, embellish, or water down the severity of our colonizers' history. I don't know if celebrating convict colonizers who have stolen land, haven't made repatriations, who are a bunch of whinging alcoholic abusers, should be a priority of celebration, especially when so many in our Indigenous communities continue to suffer. Excellent point made by this person. The disrespect of First Nations Australians continues to this day, and remote areas in particular suffer in their lack of support for Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. Here are some more responses I wanted to include that I figured would be valuable to the conversation. Well, for starters, to call it Australia Day when it is a celebration around the brutal eradication, assimilation, and subjugation of the Indigenous peoples is in and of itself a cruel joke. European settlers have no place claiming a celebration of Australia given what our ancestors did. Australia Day, I'll refer to it as Invasion Day going forward, should be a day of mourning, acknowledgement of wrongs committed, and reparations given to the now living descendants of the First Nations peoples who survived the invasion and colonization of white people into Australia. Furthermore, to have Invasion Day held on January 26th, a day where the First Fleet made landfall and began the cruelty that followed, is centering the oppressors as the heroes worthy of celebrations rather than the villains that oppressed an entire country's peoples. If it must go ahead, then the date should at least be changed, and only in accordance with First Nations leaders' inputs. But frankly, I believe the entire holiday ought to be scrapped, and a separate day, one of mourning and recognition, should be established. Again, with First Nations leaders' input and leadership. My family never celebrated January 26th. My dad came here at 16, no English. He saw and experienced a lot of racism, especially Indigenous. He helped whoever he could, was never a bystander, and taught me to respect Indigenous people as they were here first and treated like shit for no reason. The more I learned of real history, the more I understood why the 26th of January isn't anything to celebrate. It's way past due to change the date and change the flag. 26th of January should be a day of reflection, mourning, and respect for the survival in spite of the odds the colony stacked against them. Just my thoughts. January 26th is a day of mourning for Aboriginal people and represents the beginning of a genocide. Even separate from this, it's just a really weird day to celebrate as a country. The founding of a prison colony is not exactly the day Australia started. It wasn't a good day for most of the people who arrived that day, and it was a terrible day for the people who were already here. Surely we can find a better day to celebrate Australia. It's simply not a day to celebrate. No argument I've heard otherwise counters the fact that it is not a day to celebrate our First Nations people. It's about being kind and about acknowledging the hurt and continuing suffering that they have been put through. There is no history to January 26th. It's only officially been Australia Day for about as long as I've been alive. This is nothing in comparison to the 60,000 years of continual culture before it. Honestly, to respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the date needs to be changed so it's not celebrated on a day of grieving for those lost while trying to survive on their home turf from an invasion of people not native to the land. I really don't celebrate it as I don't see the day as something worth celebrating. In the end, it's just a day that's like every other. Why treat it as anything else if you're not native? Honestly, the 26th should be a day just for Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders to think back to their past and use it as a way to strengthen themselves in their present, to look forward with a view not tainted by the hatred of a celebration. In the end, I end up just being one voice of many who, much like me, would be drowned out if it weren't for people speaking up as a group. The government wouldn't change it, they are too used to the schedule. But that doesn't mean it can't be spoken about. A new date would be good, especially for those native to feel better, but in the end, we can only pray. Hopes and dreams constantly shattered, but if we keep pushing, keep speaking up, maybe one day the date can finally be changed. I don't celebrate Australia Day because I don't feel any real connection to it. Marketed as a day to celebrate being Australian, yet we're commemorating the first day of British colonialism. We're still going, yippee, we're a colony in this day and age. Australia as a country is so much more than that. As much as people want to say that the meaning of it has changed over time, is that really true? If the meaning of it has changed, why is keeping it on this date so important? That being said, actually changing the date has its pros and cons. On the one side, it doesn't do anything real to Aboriginal Aussies, but also it would be a very public first step to show that the government is willing and listening to the needs of the people. I think if being Australian really matters and people really stand behind the idea that we've moved forward and it isn't about the start of colonial rule, then the date can change. To me, it's a performative celebration of the worst parts of our history and the worst parts of our current society. The racism that is allowed when debating if the date should change is a damning indictment of the inherent exclusion of Aboriginal people built into the current concept of Australia Day. Focus on binge drinking, gambling, and good weather are incredibly detrimental, while also being immensely effective distractions from the serious threats to our country, such as climate change and the widening wealth gap. We allow our values to be built on the dehumanization and genocide of the Aboriginal people, we can have no reasonable expectation that our society would ever protect its citizens. The racism that plagues this debate was discussed in the last section, which further proves this. Australia Day is the day the British invaded and began their genocidal rampage across the land, raping, burning, and pillaging. We're not Israel, so why are we celebrating the bloodthirsty slaughter and barbaric destruction of the oldest culture in the world? I have a lot of opinions on Israel and not a lot of positive ones. I also have a lot of opinions on the state of the Australian government and not a lot of positive ones. Now, this personal response leads perfectly into the next point of discussion. I do not celebrate Australia Day. I used to, as my family has ever since I was young. However, I haven't for a good few years as I've learnt what the day means for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's a day of mourning, surviving, and the start of violence, disposition, and loss of culture. Although I've heard of opinions from both sides on if it should or shouldn't change, I believe it should change as it would show respect and understanding. It would show compassion and regret from what has happened in the past, not just by moving on, but by remembering all those who survived and those who were lost. However, the most important thing we should do is listen to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. The ones' voices who matter the most are the voices of those who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Here are some of the responses from Aboriginals who took my survey. Personally, I don't feel comfortable celebrating when the origins of Australia Day were literally to celebrate colonization. It's disgusting. Colonization is not something that should be celebrated personally. I am mob. It is celebrating the arrival of death and destruction in a long and torturous way that still continues to harm people. It should be changed. It's not like it has always been on that day anyway. As an Aboriginal, it's clearly not a day to celebrate. I always wanted to celebrate Australia and be involved in that, but as I grew older and heard the other side of the debate, I never felt welcome. How is it that the day that is supposed to celebrate our country makes the First Nations people of the country feel unwelcome? Unwelcome in their own land and country. The people want change, a change in the flag and the date to better represent Australia, or at least what they want for its future. Neutral. There are some who are completely neutral in this debate and don't have strong opinions on the subject that get overlooked quite a bit. They use January 26th as an excuse to catch up with family and just may not have much information on January 26th history or even Australia's history of colonisation at all. They're just happy to get a public holiday, just another day off from work. A couple of participants in my survey labelled themselves as neutral, but labelled themselves as not knowing much at all about Australia's history of January 26th. One respondent said, "It's a family get-together day. I believe that it is a tradition that should be upheld, but if it's that harmful to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, then the date should be changed. In the end, it's just a date, and we can celebrate our culture together whenever. I sometimes celebrate Australia, though I'm not too fussed on the date." I want to pull back up the Reddit thread from earlier to present more on this mostly neutral view. I don't care what day it falls on, but we need a national day. You'll find most people are basically, if the date is offensive to First Nations people, change it. We don't care. But can we have a day where we all celebrate being Australian and get the day off too? But the media gets involved and pretty much prints outrage daily, so people argue among themselves, divide and conquer and all that. In my observations, mainstream media pushes this debate more, but I feel like focuses more on the debate and division rather than the actual issues that historically plague Australia Day that could be helpful in informing people so the public can form an educated opinion. The neutral survey respondents support the claim of the Redditor too. My own perspective and conclusion. Some Australians celebrate Australia Day on January 26th for pride in their country, but can we have patriotic pride in a nation that actively discriminated and continues to discriminate the First Nations peoples? I think there is a respectful way to go about it where the past is acknowledged and we can look towards improving Australia for a better future. To put it bluntly, Australia is a racist country. I'm of the opinion that if you celebrate Australia Day, no matter what the date is, the past should always be acknowledged. Have a yarn with Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders and take steps towards reconciliation. The small steps lead to bigger jumps. This country is in desperate need of changes. I think the date should be changed so we can have a more inclusive day to celebrate Australia. For us all as Australians. Yes, I'm including immigrants when I say Australians, because you white fellas' ancestors were also immigrants once, whether you want to admit it or not. Australia is a beautiful multicultural place. Should that not be celebrated on a more respectful date where the Indigenous people feel welcome and safe? To have a celebration on the day of the beginnings of slaughter, rape, and the attempted erasure of our cultures seems disrespectful and leaves the Indigenous peoples feeling left out. It's a day of mourning, not celebration, and there are plenty of other options for dates available that aren't so insensitive. It makes you wonder why people are so adamant against changing the date when the date was only established as Australia Day in the 90s. Australia has a long way to go in terms of reconciliation. Thank you all for watching. This was a project I had in the back of my mind for a while since I started speaking up about Invasion Day and being Aboriginal online. I wanted to try and present this video with an open mind to the viewers who may be watching. I'm not attempting to shame anyone who is unaware or uneducated, but I will shame those who are blatantly racist or attempt to spread misinformation in hopes of fear-mongering. If you like this video and want to see more of this style of content, let me know. I occasionally do talk about serious political and social topics here and on my Twitch, so it's not like it's new territory for me to tread. I like having these conversations, educating people, and learning a lot myself from these conversations. I've linked all my resources and references below. Have a good day or night wherever you are, stay deadly, and remember, be empathetic, be open, do your research, and most importantly, listen to Indigenous voices.